it is getting close to the 4th of July. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about that, just some kind of interesting things that you may not know. But, first off, always try to liven things up. There was a teacher that was talking to her class about the American Revolution and, what that means and all that. And she said, about 200 years ago, our forefathers took on the British Army and beat them. And one little boy said, wow, 4 guys beat a whole army? They must have been really strong. So, there's also all the little corny jokes that kids have. What did one American flag say to the other? Nothing. They just waved. And just what kind of spirit or what kind of ghost haunted King George III? The spirit of 76. The story's told another one in a school where the principal comes into this room while the teacher's teaching all about the states and the revolution and how many states there are now and all that. And so he asked the kids, and he went up to the blackboard, and he asked them to try to name all of the states. And so as they're calling them out, he's writing them down as it goes. And when they got done, they had about 40. And he turned around and looked at the kids, and he said, when I was your age, we had to know the name of all the states. And one little boy in the back said, yeah, but then there was only 13 of them. So, the 4th of July is something we celebrate a lot here in the country. And I had somebody ask not too long ago, or actually heard somebody ask not too long ago, do they have a July 4th in England? And the guy said, yeah, it occurs right between the 3rd and the 5th. So, sometimes we do get kind of crazy things about that and all that. So, another little kid's joke is do you know why there's no knock-knock jokes about the U.S. government? Because freedom rings. So, some of the things about the Revolutionary War, just some interesting facts about it. There were 2 groups of people. They were either called the Patriots or the Loyalists, or the Tories or the Yankees, depending on who you were talking to and whether they had any kind of favor between them. And a lot of people think that it was just, the white Americans fighting the white British, but that wasn't the case. As a matter of fact, there were a lot of Indians involved in the war. So, and growing up in Vincennes, you hear a little bit about that because of the fort that was down there that controlled the area of all or parts of about 5 states. There were a lot of blacks involved in the war. The very first victim of the war at the bridge of Concord and Lexington was a man by the name of Crispus Attucks, and who was a black man. So the very first patriot to die in the Revolution was a black man. And then there was James Armitage, who was a black man who had been a slave and been freed, but went to serve with the British as a slave. He went to the British as an escaped slave, so to speak, and served the British officers. And they thought that he was, that he definitely wasn't a patriot. He had escaped from those people over there. And he became one of the greatest spies of the Revolutionary War. He would take and he would literally serve them their tea and their crumpets and all that stuff, and would stand kind of at attention at the back of the tent while they were discussing their plans and what they were going to do. And then he had a little system of how he could go out and get it back to Washington. And the British really didn't think much about him coming and going and leaving, because they thought this man is not going to go back to the side of the Patriots or the revolutionaries, because he'll be too afraid that they're going to capture him and make him a slave again. And so they paid no attention to him, and he gathered a lot of facts and carried them back. There were a lot of women in the war too, and they served in kind of some different ways. One of the ways that women served in the war was there was this group that was called Washington Secret Six. They belonged to the CIA. Now, that's not what you're thinking. The CIA back then was the Continental Intelligence Agency. But it was a group that George Washington put together, and only George Washington knew who these six were. And even today, historians don't know who those six were. But one of those, or a couple of those six, were actually women that would give code to to Washington and his officers that would carry things back and forth. There were women that served. There were some women, because back then women didn't serve in the military. There were some women that they know that dressed like men and went to war, went to battle, went to training camp, did all that as men to be able to fight in the war. And then there were people like Molly Pitcher. That's a story we learned about as kids, that Molly, seeing her husband being shot, he was a loader of an artillery cannon, and so she went up and took his place on the cannon until that battle was over. And then she spent the rest of the war running up and down the battlefield with a pitcher, taking water to the soldiers, especially those that were wounded. And then because of that, a lot of other women began to do that, and they were all called Molly Pitchers. It just became kind of a standard name for them all. And kind of getting back to the whatever that was, to the diversity of the war. There were over 5,000 blacks that served in the war. Now, you may not think that sounds like a whole lot, but there was only about 25,000 men at a time that were serving. It actually topped out once at about 40 on the side of the colonists, as they were called then. And it was the American Revolution was one of the costliest wars in the way of how many people died. The only one that surpasses it is the Civil War as far as population. The pure numbers may not be as bad, but it was quite a few. Now, one of the interesting things too, that 42,000 British sailors defected. We always heard those stories as kids, how the British would come on the shore. They would sneak in at night. Guys were coming out of the pubs or hanging around on corners. They'd knock them over the head, knock them out, take them on the boat until they loaded up enough of them. Then they would sail away, and it was either become a sailor or go swimming for a long time. So at the time of the Revolutionary War, about 90% of the population were farmers. And so that's one of the things that hampered the Revolution. We read about people being out in Valley Forge in the winter times and all that, and that wasn't a real big deal. But there were a lot of men that left to go back to farming, and they would come back again, and so they would lose a lot. There was over 200,000 men that served on the colonist side. But the most that ever served at one time was only about 42,000. It was always something that George Washington struggled with, as far as whether or not he would have enough of an army to put him on, and who would be willing to re-enlist. Now, one of the things that that's always been one of those things that's been said so many times in schools and histories and on plays and TVs and all that, was about Paul Revere. Now, Paul Revere was a real man. He was a silversmith, and he was part of a group that was put together to ride. We know about the Old North Church and one if by land, two if by sea, the lights up in the church. And you always see them riding their horses through the towns as they're calling out to everybody. And what are they usually hollering? No, it's not the British are coming. Whether you ever thought about it or not, they were all British. The colonists at this time were still British. This was before the Declaration of Independence had been signed or anything else. It was the regulars are coming. The regulars are coming. That's the regular army. The soldiers are coming. Because to say the British are coming, That's like us. It's like somebody riding down the road here and screaming out, "The Americans are coming! The Americans are coming!" And everybody's going to say, "Yeah, what? We live here. Where else would we be going?" So the war itself was not an easy war. It was not a quick war. Uh, it lasted 8 years, 8 long years, uh, and a lot of those times there was. It was not. They were not good. You know, we read about Valley Forge and all those, and some of the other things that they went through. And actually, the conditions in the camps were so bad. And you have to remember that back in those days, they didn't have penicillin. They didn't have alcohol. They didn't have a lot of those things. It's thought that on the American side, about 25,000 men died. Some estimates, of course, are higher. Some are lower. But of that 25,000, only about 8,000 died in battle. The rest, almost 2 to 1, died of disease, either disease from wounds and that sort of thing, but even more so from disease like diphtheria. A lot of them died on British warships or British prison ships that would be anchored in the middle of a harbor, and they would just put the men in there. And if somebody committed disease, that got passed along everybody. So, you know, when you think about these guys going to battle and the things that they did, one of the things that we forget about is how bad they suffered quite a bit, and that 2 to 1 more died out from disease than they did from on battlefield deaths and through the direct deaths on that battlefield through the warfare. You know, one of the things that George Washington did when he was first appointed as the commander of the Continental Army, and he looked around and he saw all of the disease and all the stuff going on, because there weren't really any latrines. He kind of went back to his biblical roots. George Washington was a very much studier of the Bible. And he went back and followed what the Jewish army always did, and they put the latrines and everything outside the camps. Back then, guys would just go outside the tent and go, and Washington made them start going to latrines that were set up to go. They buried stuff as it went and all that, and helped to wipe out a lot of the disease. One of the other things that happened, interesting fact about George Washington, is George Washington had a half-brother quite a bit older than him who got tuberculosis, and he went to the Caribbean because they thought that, you know, that's the best thing to do to get to where you can breathe better and all that. So he goes down to the Caribbean with his brother, and while he was down there, he did. He caught a disease, smallpox. And he survived it. He's one of the few that survived. But one of the things that it did is when that was going through the camps, that Washington survived it. He had built up immunity to it. And one of the things that they did kind of early on that you don't hear about too much, and it's kind of like we think about in vaccines today. They didn't know anything about vaccines, but there were certain people that they took blood out of Washington. You know, it may not have been much, but they would take it out of Washington and put it into others to help fight that disease. And so, you know, that was kind of one of the new things about it. One of the other things, too, is you don't hear much, but George Washington's wife, you know, good old Martha Washington, she also came and toured camps with George to try to encourage the troops and do a lot of those things. You know, and during the Revolutionary War, there was a man who started off that was the greatest hero, battlefield hero of the Revolution. Now, you know, everybody looked to George Washington as kind of the father of the country, the head of the army, and George Washington was a good battlefield soldier, but one battlefield commander in particular was known for his bravery, his daring, his wits on the battlefield, his strategies, and all that, and especially with the Battle of Saratoga, which kind of changed the war, and one of the first ones that they won, and was considered by everybody to be about the best. And George Washington looked up to him as his best battlefield commander. And that guy went from being the best of the battlefield commanders, the greatest hero of the Revolutionary War, except for George Washington, to become the greatest traitor of our country's history. And people even still use his name today to talk about people that become traitors. And of course, that was Benedict Arnold. And Benedict Arnold did become kind of sorry about what he did. Of course, he finished out his life in England, and but he insisted that when he died, he was buried in his Continental Army uniform, not his British uniform that he got when he deserted and all of that. So, you know, when the war came to an end, there were a couple of things that happened. Number one, with Washington's last battle and the surrender of almost 6,000 British troops, he defeated the British general of Cornwallis. Cornwallis was so ashamed of his loss and of the British loss, because you need to understand, the British were considered the best military force in the world. They had colonies on every continent except for Antarctica, and so nobody could beat the British. And then for this group of just a bunch of guys getting together to fight them, the British, for one thing, thought it'd be a short war, and it was not. 8 years. And they definitely would not refer to George Washington as Sir, or with any kind of dignity, and not even so much because he was the leader of the army. That happened. George Washington served in the British Army. He was a commander in the French Indian War, but they would not, anybody that was not born in England, George Washington was born in the colonies in Virginia. Anybody born in England was looked down upon. You're not good enough to be called British. You're not good enough to be a Sir. And of course, you know, they had the lords and all those things. And so for Cornwallis to have to surrender to somebody that he thought was that much below himself, he didn't even go out to the surrender. He sent his second in command out with his sword, Cornwallis's sword, to take it to surrender. And so when the second in command came up and they said, "Where's Cornwallis?" said, "Well, he's ill and unable to be here." And they went to present the sword to Washington, as they would do. Washington shook his head and pointed at his second in command and said, "Give it to him." So Washington, you know, the whole point was, you know, if you think you're below me and you're sending out a subordinate to do that, I am not taking it from a subordinate. One of my subordinates will take it from your subordinate. And it kind of went that way. Now, one of the things that affects us as United Methodists, I don't know if you ever thought about how this came to be, but, you know, there were, freedom of religion was not something that was really around back then. There were 4 of the 13 colonies had total freedom of religion. The other 9 had state-sponsored churches where they collected taxes and the government paid for the churches. And so, you know, there was a national British church that by being a British citizen, you had to belong, and that was called the Anglican Church. That's where our founder, John Wesley, was Anglican. But Wesley started this movement of these people called Methodists because he was anal and he had a method for everything. And that's kind of where the term came from. And because of all the methods that they had, and he had started sending people over here as Methodists, as non-Anglican. Well, you know, the Anglican Church has another name. We call it the Church of England. And so the Church of England was over here. And everybody was expected, well, no, not expected. You were by birth. If you were born English, you belonged to the Church of England. It's the same group, you know, with the Archbishop of Canterbury, that the kings and the queens and the princes and all of those that get married in, that you probably watched on TV not too long ago. But now, all of a sudden, England is not in control. And this Church of England begins to panic, so they did 2 things. The first one was, most of them beat it back to England on the last few ships out of town. It's kind of like catch the last bus before the bus stop closes and get out of town before dark falls. It was kind of one of those things. A lot of them, it was a rush to get out of town on those last buses because the Church of England answers to the King of England. And so most of the patriots, the revolutionaries, saw these people as traitors and people who were preaching, you need to stay loyal to the crown. You need to stay loyal to the king. Don't be a part of this revolutionary. Now, all of a sudden, they're on the outside looking in. They beat it to the coast. The other thing that some of them did was they stayed here and they changed their name. They didn't call themselves Anglican. They didn't call themselves the Church of England. You've probably heard of them. They're called the Episcopalians. That's where that came from. And that is the old Church of England, but now based in the United States. But where it mattered for us was Wesley started sending his Methodist ministers over to lead the people in this country. John Wesley actually was over here for a while in Savannah, Georgia, before the Revolutionary War and served in a church down there. Matter of fact, Gail and I were down there a few years ago. There's a statue of John Wesley down there in Savannah, not very far from Paula Dean's restaurant, but there's a big bronze statue, or life-size bronze statue of Wesley. He wasn't a very big guy. But part of the reason we're here is because part of the reason we are Methodist is because of the Revolutionary War, and so it's I kind of close it all up, and the Bible. I forgot and left my Bible in the other room, but the Bible reference tonight basically is from Peter and a couple others. It says, pray for the country in which you live, pray for the leaders of your country. Paul says that too. Because when there is peace in your country, there is peace for everyone. And that good leaders take care of the good people. And they only punish those that need punishing. Now, they also talk about, bad leaders and all that. And one of the things that our founding fathers did is, and you'll see it in the newsletter if you get our newsletter, I've pulled out some parts of the Declaration of Independence where they recognized God and thought that what they were doing, let me rephrase that, they knew in their hearts and in their souls what they were doing was from God and starting this country off the bat from God. And all these people that tell you that the United States was started as a secular country, no. Now, all you have to do is read the Declaration of Independence. They talk about that we are created and that we are endowed certain rights by our Creator. If that's not God, I don't know who it is. They talk about the laws of nature and nature's God. It talks about God at the end causing providence, which means God is controlling things and setting things into action. And so our country was bounded upon what's called the Judeo-Christian ethic. It was founded upon Christian ideals. It was founded on the rights of people. And even the whole idea that all men are created equal goes back to, all the way back to Genesis. It goes back to Noah. It goes back to Adam. And even coming forward with the Jewish people and all of those, everybody was created equal. Even the kings, when they were selected according to God, they were all created equal. There was nobody any greater. We are all people of equal worth before God. Jesus died for all of us just the same. He didn't spill any more blood for the royalty than he did for the commoners. We see everybody as equal. We are all the same in God's eyes. Christ died for all of us. And that whole idea of equality, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, says that God made us all the same. Nobody's any better than anybody else. Everybody has rights that are not given by people, but are given by God Himself. And if you think they didn't get that from the Bible, then you got your head in the sand, and your fingers in your ears, and your eyes closed, and you just refuse to see what is there. And some people refuse to see what is there. So when July 4th comes up, celebrate. We're going to be in church celebrating, and just come celebrate with us at church. Go to church somewhere and celebrate. Thank God for this country that we have, for the founding fathers that brought it all together in the name of God, that we are all equal before God. And we all have those unalienable rights that were endowed to us by the God that we serve. So, hope you have a good evening. And so I just hope that you go and be blessed and then be a blessing to others. And then we'll hopefully see you on Sunday morning. No Bible study Sunday night. We're going to be doing the fireworks thing with some family. So we'll see you then.